like a forensic science failure, and this is the opposite. So it's got some yin and yang.
But it was fascinating. Again, you're right. Right? Curtin isn't cooperating with me today. There we go. All right. The only thing I ask of everyone is if you could turn your phones off so that they don't ring while the author is talking.
Let me be the first to do it.
And I need to do the same thing. There we go. I love that you're all here today because this is so close to the holidays and everybody is madly running around trying to get caught up, and I haven't even started. So I'm sure the author, and I know I appreciate you coming and spending the time with us. I haven't finished this book, but I'm finding it fascinating, well into it. And Edward and I were discussing the fact that archaeology, but the history of people and family lives is fascinating to me because I didn't know a lot about my background. And so much comes out when you join, what is it, Ancestry.com?
Or 23andMe or
Yeah, any of
other
those.
services.
You find out some amazing things. And some people have said to me, maybe I don't want to know. But who wouldn't want to? Even if you had something terrible in the background, it still is fascinating to know what happened before. So I'm anxious to hear what you have to say about this book, Edward. And he's going to tell us about the Forever Witness, right?
Yes.
Okay.
I could pick another topic if you prefer. Hey, thank you all for coming. This is really as Ann said, we're also busy these days, and it's just really fun to get together and talk books. And I want to have a conversation, actually, not just have me yak. So actually, I have a question. How many of the people present have taken a DNA genealogy test? Wow. Most of the people present. And what were you looking for when you did that? What were you hoping to find out?
You know, I was hoping that I was some mixture of many, many elements, but it turned out, nope, pure Eastern European.
Just what you were always told, right? So no big secrets. How about
Both of my parents were from Poland, so it just turned out that apparently they're very pure. You know, other people get their sample and oh, they're Native American, they're English, they're French, they're German. Mm-mm.
So no surprises.
Right.
But you still were glad you did it? Did you have a good experience?
And I saved the rest of my family money.
Anyone else want to share their experience with genealogy?
I did
Listen.
this. I'm going to take this off because I can't talk to that. I did the 23andMe because I wanted the ancestry, but I also wanted the health side of things because they do a lot of surveys with you, and they can tell you whether you have genes that are going to show up for things. Like they let me know that I don't have the gene preclusive for
Baldness?
for Parkinson's, which is, I wasn't worried about that. It's good to hear some things that, you know, that you might have in your background or you don't have in your background, and, you know, what could come out of this. I did have 3 distant relatives, like probably second and third cousins, that got in touch with me, who'd also done the same testing, and found out that we had the same great-grandparents and things like that. So that's been kind of fun to relate to some people. There wasn't anybody that showed up immediately that I didn't know about already, but it was of interest. My kids were interested too, so they did it as well. They were very happy to find out that I was for sure their mother.
I'm glad they weren't disappointed to find out for sure.
There was no question about that, yeah.
When I did mine, I came up with what you wanted to do. It was like a Heinz 57. It was primarily English and Irish, but there were so many other little slots of countries listed in there, I was amazed. So it's funny how it varies.
Yeah. Did anyone find something surprising in their results? Sam?
I found a little bit of surprise. I'd signed up because I don't know much about my father's family, and I found a little bit on him there, but pretty much those results were consistent. But what was the real surprise was the narrative in my family is that we're Irish American, and it's always been Erin go bragh, corned beef and cabbage. We have 5% Irish. Most of it is Scotch.
That's all you need.
Yeah, that's all you need, evidently. But it's such a against the narrative of the family, you know.
Wow.
It was just interesting to me, the myths that we grow up with.
Well, that's a great segue. So, did anyone know that you might be crowdsourcing a murder investigation when you were taking those tests? I mean, can you imagine that you've done one of these maybe years ago and you kind of forgot about it, and all of a sudden you get a knock on the door and you look outside and there's 2 cops standing on your doorstep, and there's badges on their belt, and you have no idea why they're there, and they tell you, well, we're investigating a homicide, and it's a member of your family that we're investigating. And it's, you know, can you, what, who? And then the kicker is, and the reason we're knocking on your door because your DNA helped us find this person. And I just can, that unimaginable moment when you find out you are in fact assisting, unbeknownst to you, in a homicide investigation, and maybe somebody you're related to is part of it. That was the shared experience in people had in the story in this book and in all these other cold cases you've probably read about that have been solved in this way. And it's kind of a Pandora's box, because you know you have a test and it confirms what you know, but other people are finding out things like, my dad's not my dad, or Senator Elizabeth Warren finds out those family stories about her Native American ancestry just don't pan out. And when I was first learning about this, I went to a genealogy conference, the Genealogy Jamboree. I mean, it sounds like a happy times. And this was right before this explosion in cold case solving was about to unfold, or right after actually. And they were doing demonstrations where people who would have had their test results in hand and were having difficulty figuring out what was what and what it meant. And I was sort of observing an ordinary woman. She was, I'd say, in her mid-70s, and she had done this test, and she was really excited about it, but she said, I don't understand who this is. And this look came over the genealogist, and finally she says, well, that's your father. No, this is my father, but I had to put him on the list myself because he didn't, and then it kind of dawned on her what was going on. And that is such a common occurrence that they have given this sort of innocent sounding acronym for this process. They call it, we found an NPE on their family tree. It's the not parent expectant finding. That actually can happen for a number of reasons, not the most obvious one, although the most obvious reason is usually the most common. So digging into that universe of this testing and how it can unfold secrets was part of the process of writing this book. Because 40 million Americans have taken these tests since they became popularized, in the early teens, where you could test your large portions of your genome instead of just very small sections of your inherited genetic code. And it's been eye-opening. And the people who were pioneering the use of this weren't in crime labs or forensics, science research programs, not even in law enforcement. I should pause and see who's coming. Come on in. Join us. There was the process of taking these DNA tests and the data they exposed, and as the databases grew larger, they grew more powerful. The people who figured out how to take it beyond finding out who your great grandma was, or whether you really came from Ireland or Nigeria or wherever, were early adopters and hobbyists and enthusiasts, and they got so good at it that people would come to them for help, because they'd post online about their findings and how their discoveries, And it started with adopted people who wanted to find out who their birth families were. So now there's a novel problem, right? You have, you or I would take a DNA test. We know who our parents are. We know who our immediate family is. We already have a family tree to start with. And now you had people with DNA who had no idea who their closest biological relatives were.
It kind of gets lost towards the back. So do you want me to give it back to you, or do you
I
just
can-
want to speak louder?
I'll just speak louder. How about that?
I know it's hard, but something in the middle of the store swallows up the voice.
Okay, how's
Okay.
this? All right, we good?
Thank
So they had to learn how to reverse engineer a family tree, not knowing your starting point and searching backwards from the DNA results for many people until you find links to the adopted person whose identity you don't know, whose birth family you don't know. And once you find those connections, find the common ancestor, several generations, it could be 5 generations in the past, and then build the family trees forward. And it can be an arduous process, because when you go back several generations, the branches of the trees become very large and very variegated. And a few people are really adept at doing that and combining documents and archives, birth records, and these DNA results in very effectively to find the identity of people who don't know their identity. Amnesiacs as well. Egg and sperm donor babies have found their heritage despite all the confidentiality surrounding that process. And then it finally occurred to a few people who were really good at this, including an Orange County resident you may have heard of, C.C. Moore. She's been in the news quite a bit, and she was the expert. This was her first criminal case. She figured out, well, what's the difference between crime scene DNA and the DNA that one of my adopted clients gives me? It's the same thing. It's the same process. I can solve crimes. And she went years ago. She went to some forensics conferences and law enforcement conferences and tried to explain that what she was doing wasn't just finding your great-grandma, but she could help you find killers who were eluding the more conventional approaches with DNA. And he gave her a pat on the head, basically, and said, "Sure, lady, what do you do for a living? You're an actress, and you get these $69 tests off of Amazon. You're gonna beat our $1 billion DNA program that the FBI's run for 20 years? I don't think so." But she had the last laugh. She has now solved more cold cases than anyone on the planet. She was one of the people who became, she is a character in real life, but she became a character in my book as well, as part of this investigation. And I wanted to focus at first on the DNA because that's the thing that first drew me into this story. But then I got to meet the people who actually lived through this loss of 2 young people, the arduous and long and multi-generational drama to find answers to what happened.
I'm just going to set it there and catch it. You don't have
I'm
to-
sorry, I blew. That's what's here. I'll just take it. There we go. How's that?
Good.
Staticky. It was a multi-generational drama, both in law enforcement and in the family. And I don't want to give away a lot of the plot, but I don't think I've had this this collection of characters. Every one of my books has had one or two characters that really stand out, and in this case it was an entire ensemble of memorable people who were kind enough and generous enough to share their stories, whether it was the families of the victims in the case, Tanya Van Kuylenborg and Jay Cook, the detective who was involved, the genetic genealogist, C.C. Moore, even the jurors. Uncharacteristically, when you cover trials as a journalist, it's hard to get jurors to talk. They said, "We want to talk about this because this was wrenching for us too." That was gratifying, but it also allowed me to tell the story the way I really wanted to, the human side, the
in the face of the inhumanity of a murder of an 18-year-old young woman and her 20-year-old boyfriend, for no reason other than evil intent, to be able to find the humanity in that story was something I hoped for, and because the folks I was writing about were so generous about their stories, I think I was able to, and it was truly rewarding. And I don't usually do a lot of readings, but one of the characters that really resonated with me was Tanya's dad, Willem van Cuylenborg, and I'll tell you a little bit about him. This happens early in the book, so I don't think I'm giving away too much. He knew something was wrong when his daughter and her boyfriend didn't return as scheduled. Actually, that was not unusual because Tanya and Jay were often late for things, but Tanya always called and to let her parents know she was okay, she was running late, she'd be there soon. And this is in 1987 when the crimes occurred, November 1987, so just a little over 35 years ago. She'd find a phone. She'd find a payphone because they kind of existed then, or a friendly store owner or someone who would let her use the phone, and she always called. And when she didn't call, they knew something had gone wrong. What it was, this overnight drive that she and Jay had done from their home in Vancouver Island, Canada, about a 5-hour journey with ferries and driving to Seattle. They were supposed to be back the next day. So when 2 days had gone by and he hadn't heard, and no one in the family's heard, he had called the local police and the police in Washington, and they said, 2 kids in love, come on. This happens all the time. They'll be home soon. There's nothing we're going to do or can do. So he undertook his own search for days, for most of a week, retracing the route across the Washington and the wildness of the Olympic Peninsula. And he tried everything. He stopped at stores and gas stations and every police department on the way. And finally, when he thought he was making progress, he had visited the Seattle Police Department, and the detective there said, I believe you. I'm going to open up a missing persons case. We're going to pull out all the stops and try and find your daughter. And he was so excited, he immediately went to a payphone to call home to tell his wife the good news. And she said, well, I got a call too. And it was from a rural area in Washington where the sheriff's department found a young woman's body, and they don't know who it is, but it fits Tanya's description. And against all advice and suggestions, Tanya's dad decided to drive the hours to where this body had been found, and to the funeral home where she was, and to see if it was in fact his daughter. So I'm going to just read a little bit about what happened next. Bill didn't know if the old trope about the key events in your life replaying in your mind at the moment of death was true. But he found something much like it happened when you learned your child is dead. A flash of indelible moments, large and small, from her birth to her first steps, to her crewing his boat, to her walking out the door with a wave for the very last time. A boundary was fixed inside him then, one that would dominate the rest of his life. There would be the world with Tanya in it on one side, and the world without her on the other. And he wasn't sure in that moment how he could survive on this side of the line. With his son standing beside him, Bill Van Cuylenborg nodded slowly and said, yes, this is my Tanya, was my Tanya. At the time, he thought he had just experienced the hardest thing he would ever endure in his life. But he was wrong. So let's see. Genealogy, murder. I want to tell you about one more character in the book, and it won't take more than 2 minutes. That's the character that's kind of your guide as you read this book. He's a career sheriff's deputy and detective named Jim Scharf. He became the cold case detective and worked on this case for 13 years. And you'd think that it would be hard for someone who invested so much to have someone like C.C. Moore, a genealogist, come in and quickly find something he couldn't do in all that time, but quite the opposite reaction. This is a man with a colossal amount of empathy, and that's a rare commodity in these times, and even rarer for a cop who's arrested so many violent criminals and seen so much. But he was overjoyed, and he just can't sing the praises of genetic genealogy and the people who know how to do it more. And this is the cool thing about Detective Scharf. He two cool things. Once he was really good at getting people to confess, and once he hugged a confession out of a suspect. He literally just said, "Boy, you look like you need a hug," and he said, "I do." and so he gave him a big hug and said, "Is there anything you want to tell me?" He said, "Yeah, I did it." And that's his way. It's to empathize people into doing what he needs them to do, but it's genuine. He is an expert marksman. He has won many years in a row when he was younger law enforcement target shooting competitions. And yet, despite arresting hundreds of violent criminals in his career, he has never used his firearm outside the target range. And he said, "I've never had to, because I make sure I don't have to." And I thought, wow, that's a cop I want to write about. And it's quite remarkable. So he is sort of the thread in this story for me, and I hope for readers, that kind of ties things together, since the story takes place 35 years ago and also in the present. And so he's your guide through that journey, and yeah, as he was for me. And so I think I'm done. Well, apparently I'm not done. I'm done with the exposition, and I'd much rather have a conversation and take any questions on this, or, well, anything else. So, does anyone have a question about genealogy, about murder, about me?
Well,
Anne?
I might have missed it because I had to do other things, but what brought you to this story?
Well, actually, we were living in Seattle, and this is probably should have said this was principally set in the Pacific Northwest. And what drew my attention, in addition to the fact that the solving of this case kind of happened in our backyard, was the fact that it happened right after the Golden State Killer arrest, which, as you may remember, was solved through this process that not anybody really understood in the general public at the time, called genetic genealogy. I mean, it had something to do with DNA. It was a little different than other kinds of DNA, but it wasn't really clear immediately, other than it had a remarkable result. This case that seemed insoluble had been solved. But I remember distinctly the coverage at the time was that this had been something like a moonshot level effort, that it took so many resources and so many hours of people working on this that we were unlikely to see this genetic genealogy, this magical process, be replicated very much. And then a couple weeks later, completely out of the blue and from different people investigating, another murder was solved. This one, in Washington State, something that had eluded generations of detectives. The original detective on the case became sheriff and appointed the new detective on the case as the cold case investigator. I mean, that's the sort of chain of time that was spent trying to figure out who killed these young people. And it turned out that C.C. Moore, the genetic genealogist, had been lobbying to be able to do this kind of case for years. And when she finally was handed the file on it and said, "Okay, so show us what you can do," She figured out the identity of the killer in 2 hours.
Oh.
It didn't take a moonshot level amount of work. It just took someone who is a master at doing this. And then 2 weeks later, there was big news. She solved another case, and then another. It's 250 cases since mid-2018 that this one person with a laptop on her couch in Orange County has solved. Murders, sexual assaults, unidentified crime victims, the Janes and John Does, as they're called, have been given back to their families because of this one person's dedication and skill. And now others are also involved in it. There's been over 400 cases now solved in this way around the country, and many more in other countries.
Did it make a significant difference in how the police looked at things? And was it across the board? You know, did every police department across the country become open-minded enough to go with this?
I think that people who were involved in cold case investigations read about this and started lining up for it. And once it was understood how it worked and how dramatic the results could be, there was broad acceptance of it. But some things have happened since the news broke on these cases that have made it a little challenging. The database that was used principally by investigators is a publicly open clearinghouse for people who take consumer DNA tests. So if you take a 23andMe test or Ancestry, the police will never search those databases. The company won't allow them to do that. But many people want to save money and broaden the power of their search, so there's a shared site where one person can take results from Ancestry, another from 23andMe, another from Family Tree DNA, any of these other companies, and they all upload it to this one site called GEDmatch. And that way you don't have to test with all the different companies to try and broaden your search. It's the one database that rules them all, kind of thing. And it's completely open. So was the mainstay for solving these criminal cases. This was run by a couple of enthusiasts, genealogy hobbyists, and people who wanted to help adopted children find their birth parents. It was run out of this retiree in Florida's bungalow in Florida. He had a couple of servers there, and it was a labor of love. It has since been bought out by a very large company called Verigen, and what used to cost a paltry sum to do an investigation now is much more costly, and has priced a lot of smaller police agencies out of the market. So one of the evolving issues is whether it makes sense for such a resource to be in private hands only, or should there also be a public counterpart, as there is for the criminal DNA database that the FBI maintains, which has no cost for police agencies to use. So this is an evolving controversy, an evolving field, and we don't know exactly where it's headed, but that's what people from the Justice Department on down are trying to figure out what to do next. So the Wild West days of just going in and doing these investigations has kind of passed, and now there's states that have passed some laws providing regulation. There's this consolidation of the industry by people who didn't develop the technology but who now are trying to capitalize on it financially, and there's a lot going on. It remains a valuable resource, and I read about a case pretty much once a week. There's a new cold case solved still through this process, so it's definitely still going, and we'll see where it takes us. And thanks for that great question, Anne. I appreciate it. Yes.
Have there been, I was watching that TV program last night, one of C.C. Moore's she was on it. But what I realized is I don't think the law is as settled in terms of courts accepting this methodology. You know, it's one thing to find who you think the murderer is. It's another thing to prosecute them.
Oh yeah.
And you know, smart lawyers knock down approaches all the time.
That they do, and that's their job. So that's a really. I'm so glad you raised that point, because the power of this genetic genealogy is that it can find people, it can identify people whose DNA isn't in the database, who maybe they've never had their DNA tested, except they left it behind at a crime scene. That's why these cases couldn't be solved, because the FBI runs a DNA database. It doesn't have genealogical information in it. It doesn't have. They don't sample the coding parts of the DNA that determine our hair color and our eye color and all our attributes. And also, that's where you look to see who you're related to, the coding parts. The DNA fingerprint database that the FBI and the Justice Department maintains just samples these little pieces of junk DNA. Think of your DNA molecule as a great big filing cabinet with a bunch of file folders in it, right? And each folder controls a different trait. Well, if you want to organize your files and figure out and keep them all in place, you also have dividers in the filing cabinet. So the DNA fingerprint comes from those dividers. It has no information in it other than its a unique identifier. It's literally a fingerprint, like your fingerprints inside each of our cells, and it's a cool way of comparing DNA from a murder victim or from a sexual assault victim, and you extract the DNA fingerprint, and there's only one person in the world that can have that fingerprint, and because it's DNA and not like an imprint of your fingers, it's a code. It's easy to build a database out. So many states, either arrestees or people convicted of crimes, have their DNA fingerprints on file. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of DNA fingerprints. And that's when the police say we're uploading the DNA to the system, that's the system they're talking about, DNA fingerprints. There's one big blind spot. If someone hasn't been caught for something, they're invisible to that system. And these cold case crimes that the police always thought were done, including this one, by serial killers who just hadn't been caught, oftentimes they're just one and done criminals. They do something terrible and they never do it again. And so they are as if above the law. And now this genetic genealogy comes along, and it can find people who aren't in the database, because it doesn't look for the only person in the universe that matches this crime scene DNA. It looks for all the people related to the person in the crime scene DNA, and that's revolutionary. And that's why the forensic science people couldn't see the value of what someone like C.C. Moore does, and she could. So the limitation there, though, is no one who's ever been identified by this genetic genealogy process has ever actually been arrested or prosecuted just based on that evidence, because you still actually haven't seen their DNA to compare it. So what they do is, what they did in this case, they had a surveillance team follow around their suspect for weeks, waiting for him to drop something or leave something behind with his DNA on it. In this case, it was a coffee cup that fell. He's a truck driver. It fell out of the cab of his truck, and they got so excited. We've got a coffee cup! And that sounds almost comical, that after all this effort, and they had 10 people tailing this guy for 2 weeks, all they got out of is a coffee cup. Except crime labs love coffee cup, because, you sip it, you're leaving behind enough DNA for 25 tests, with the amount of trace evidence that they can use now. And then they do the DNA fingerprinting, and they see, all right, is this our guy who killed Tanya and Jay, or is he not? Are we going to exonerate him or arrest him? Well, in this case, they arrested him. But, it doesn't always go that way, but usually it does, because the genetic genealogy analyses are usually spot on. But the only evidence used for establishing guilt in court will be that DNA fingerprint, not the genealogy. They'll just talk about that to explain why they targeted the suspect in the first place, who had never committed a crime, and it seemed like he was beyond reproach. So that has been accepted by the court, and the case in the Forever Witness is the first time there was a trial in which that evidence was introduced in court and used successfully. Does that answer your question?
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm fascinated by the way you bring so much information to your stories that make learning that information so fun.
Oh, thank you.
When you're going after a story, I mean, once you've decided this is something that needs to be told, do you find yourself too learning a lot of things you weren't familiar with, or is it just something you're already involved in, so you make the connection? And
It's the former, because I had no idea what genetic genealogy is before this.
yeah.
Before I read about the Golden State Killer. And then the more I learned about it, I said, boy, I'd like to read a book about this. And I said, wait a minute, maybe I can write a book about this.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, for my last book, I sort of had to dive into the world of fire investigation and figure out how that works or doesn't work. And the same for you. I think it was before you came in, I was talking about going to this genealogy jamboree, this conference of people who were adept at genetic genealogy, and also people who wanted to learn about it, or who wanted to figure out how to do it for themselves as consumers. I just interview a ton of people and read and sort of immerse myself in the subject. But that's the same way. I mean, that's what journalists do. We find sources. There's a lot of documents that I had to read through from the criminal investigation to understand that part of the story, and to talk to the people who did it, not just Jim Sharp, the current detective on it, but people who investigated back in 1987. And I talked to Tanya's family about the search that they did, and how that happened, and what life was like on Vancouver Island, which made me want to live on Vancouver Island, because it sounds like a pretty amazing place. And I did visit it, and Jay's dad and sister took me to the beach that Jay liked to go to, and they showed me on an overlook of that beach how the town put up a bench with plaques for Tanya and Jay there, because that's what small towns do. And so they became my guides too. So how do you tell this story? You find the people who lived it and who know it and who understand it, and hopefully they can help you enough to tell their story and to do justice to their story. And there was an episode of Unsolved Mysteries. You familiar with that syndicated show? And way back when, in its first season, 1989, I think it was the first or second season, they did a special, 15 minutes of the show was dedicated to Tanya and Jay's murder, and that was 2 years after the crime. And they used to have the actor Robert Stack with a baritone voice of his, and that sort of like certain intonation he used for these crimes. And it was the show was okay. It didn't tell me anything I didn't know, and didn't help. I mean, hundreds of tips came in afterwards, but none of them left. But at the same time, that aired, the local TV show in the Seattle area, this news show called Northwest Afternoon, had Jay's dad, Gordon Cook, and Tanya's dad, Bill Van Kylenberg, on together to talk about the case and about their kids and what they were like. And I think I must have watched that video, this jumpy home video somebody took of it, because I couldn't find an official archive of it. I must have watched that 20 times. It's so moving and so raw, and things that those two dads talked about, everything from whether or not they now supported the death penalty because of what happened, and what, what it was like to go. I mean, the questions were, they tried to be sensitive, but they were so unintentionally cruel. Like what it was like to go home without Tanya there. And I felt like it was my chance to meet, the closest I was going to have to meet these two men. Although I did meet Gordon, many years later. Unfortunately, not Bill. And that was a treasure for me, to be able to see them in that moment, as relatively young men, talking about this unspeakable loss, and I could see even then which of them was most likely to survive and become, find some semblance of a good life after this, and which one wasn't. It was so apparent in that video. That's my process. When I do this, that's what I look for. And in this story, I found it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Another question, because I'm really curious about some of these things. I know that at any crime scene, even years ago, they were try to be careful about picking up things as evidence. Has this technique changed what they did? Did it intensify what they would collect and save to be tested, or has it changed it in any way?
No, actually, that's really cool thing about this. They, in terms of the crime scene, the CSI part of the investigation, where you're gathering the evidence at the crime scene, it hasn't changed. And that's why this works, because in 1987, they had this biological evidence that was found, that they knew belonged to the killer. Well, actually, they had a palm print from the back of Jay's van, and they had male DNA found on Tanya's body, on her pants that were left in the van, and other places. And they preserved that. There was nothing they could really do with it at that time. The use of DNA fingerprinting was just beginning and hadn't come to Washington yet. There had been one case in the U.S. at that point in Florida where it was used. It was very novel, and it was still being challenged and figured out, the smart lawyer thing that you were talking about. So they stuck it in the freezer and said, someday we're going to be able to do something with this. So, and 7 years later, they thought out some of it and said, now there's something we can do with it. The FBI has this cool database that they're building with DNA fingerprints. Let's run it. And the detectives got really excited. This was going to be our break. Nothing. A lot of cold cases got solved in those years with the advent of this process, because a lot of crimes are committed by repeat offenders, and that system worked well with. And every time there would be a new iteration of it's called CODIS, this FBI system, they'd upload the DNA again and get excited, and nothing. And finally they stopped telling the family about developments, because they would just, they'd be so disappointed, and they almost lost hope that anything would happen. So the same DNA, the same evidence preservation that they've always done is all you need to do with this new technology. You just need to send it to a different lab to do a different kind of analysis. So it's important to preserve enough of it to do both kinds of DNA. That's the only trick. So there's actually, this is a cool side story. I'll share this with you. That if you've taken one of these 23andMe type tests, you have to send them a great big goober tube full of spit, right? And so you send them a lot of DNA because they want a lot to work with, and that way they don't have to have extremely minute amounts of the capacity to do something with just trace amounts. So there's this company that CC Moore eventually would join forces with, but this was years before that. It's called Parabon Nanolabs. You may have read about that name, but it's in Western Virginia. It used to be a supercomputer firm, and then they would it's called grid computing, where you create a supercomputer out of many smaller network computers, and they would sell that computer time mostly to the biotech industry. And then they started using it themselves because they figured, well, why don't we get into the biotech business? And they applied for a Defense Department grant for this super secret program. And basically, what they had to do is invent a combat device that you could bring out into the field and gather trace amounts of DNA evidence from unexploded bombs, the IEDs that were wreaking havoc with our troops in Afghanistan. And the goal was to find, this is going to sound like crazy science fiction, not necessarily who the terrorist, the bomb builder, was from this trace amounts of evidence, but who they were related to, what they might look like. We want to predict their ethnicity, tell us everything you can about this person. And so Parabon won the contract, and they came up with something because they had supercomputers, and they started analyzing. It was incredible. They took all these three-dimensional photographs of 10,000 volunteers. They sampled their DNA, and they linked up facial characteristics and other things about them to different code sequences in their DNA samples, and they came up with a predictor of how the terrorist would look and who they were related to, and it worked. It was basically the Google search for terrorism at that point, and then they were allowed to commercialize the technology, and they started offering. They called it snapshot. They would generate a mugshot basically and a description of criminals based on their DNA. It was unheard of. There was never anything like this. And the results vary, but some of them were so good. One man literally turned himself in when they publicized his DNA mugshot. It wasn't a real picture. It was just based upon the predictive power of certain DNA structures and numbers crunching. Biology at some point stops being a biology problem and starts being a computational problem, apparently, and that's what they figured out. Now the key is that they had to develop, and the labs they work with had to develop the ability to do these kinds of DNA analyses, not with a big tube of spit, but with just a tiny little bit amount of trace DNA that you would find on a bomb casing out in the desert, right? And that capacity didn't exist before, and now it does, because of this program. And the same kinds of DNA you do a DNA mugshot with is also the same kind that you do a genealogy study with, and that's why C.C. Moore, the genealogist, combined forces with Parabon, and how that combination, they delivered a package to Detective Sharp that showed, here's what your guy's going to look like, and here's who we think he's related to. Go get him, kind of thing. And it's definitely future tech.
This sounds like science fiction.
It does, right? Well, and it's not spot on, because they said, well, they give you a probability. Well, there's a 94% probability that the killer in this case has green eyes, and a 7% probability that he has blue eyes. So, okay, he probably got green eyes. Well, actually, he had blue eyes. Does that mean it's wrong? No, it means it's the probabilities. That's how it works. Because nothing's ever 100%. But it's, I put some of the pictures in the book next to the real people, so you can see how interesting it is. There was one killer they found in Missouri, I think it was, and he had really horrible teeth, rotten teeth, and they were all crooked and all. Well, you can't predict that from DNA because that happens in later life. But if you fix if you cover his mouth, that DNA mugshot just nailed it, But nobody, it wouldn't work. It didn't work because all you noticed about this guy was his teeth. But it's fascinating. But the key was, we can now use incredibly small amounts of trace evidence to make these deep genealogical and genomic investigations, and that's so all these pieces had to come together for any of this to happen.
Fascinating. It's really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Any more
Yeah,
questions?
once you get me started, I don't know when to stop. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's also terribly interesting and yet complex. And, any other questions from anyone? Okay.
Well,
I
thank
wanna
you so much. This has been
Thank you.
so much fun.
Me anyway.
I'll get that nuisance away from you, but it really helps.
It's been good to get him.